Okay, well, welcome to a very special edition to the Global Business Report. And it's not just special because I'm presenting it, it's special today because of our named subject matter, and that is our beloved continent of Africa. If we were to look at the continent, we know that recent developments have implied that Africa's usual trading and development partners, that is the likes of the European Union, the United States, and also China, have been facing fierce competition on the ground from other countries, the likes of Russia, Gulf states, and also Turkey. If we were to look at the findings of a global risk consultancy group by the name of Control Risk Group, we know that recent studies out of that consultancy group have found that Africa has become a lot more attractive for the prospects of international business, and this is happening at a time where wider trends have been against the grain and against the interests of international business. So to discuss this further, I'm joined in the studio by Barnaby Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher is the Associate Director of Control Risk Group, which is a consultancy I mentioned just there. He leads a group of analysts in their work in terms of consultancy, specifically for East and Southern Africa. And among the long list of responsibilities they have there is to make sure that organizations make clear and informed decisions when it comes to emerging market opportunities. And they do that by making sure that they are aware of the political, of the integrity, and also the security risks in the countries they're dealing with. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on here. So if we break the ice, as it were, and we talk about the whole of the continent as a whole, we've come across many times people saying that if you aren't doing business in Africa, you aren't doing business at all. Do you agree? Do you disagree with that statement?
So I think Control Risk is a global consultancy, and my colleagues would be fairly angry if I didn't mention the fact that there were other regions with a lot of interest and excitement and opportunities. And also, of course, the caveats when talking about Africa apply.
Absolutely.
It's 54 countries. Some are pushing ahead, some are fairly stagnant, and a few are unfortunately falling behind. But overall, Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa specifically, is the second fastest growing continent in the world. It has been for a while. It is the foremost and arguably the last great frontier market. And I think what's really interesting about Africa and what we're seeing from our client base is that 5 years ago, 80% of our clients interested in Africa were in the extractive industries. You know, that cliche of Africa's great natural wealth. It's a cliche, but it is true. But what's really exciting, I think, about Africa is, for Control Risks, that proportion of business has fallen down to about 30%. More and more of our clients are looking at finance or infrastructure or fast-moving consumer goods or logistics, a whole huge range of sectors. And those opportunities are really opening up in a way that they weren't before.
Fantastic. If we were to look at this year specifically, we know that 2019 has been a tough year for international business as a whole. If we were to look at the reasons why, could you identify why 2019 has been so difficult, and whether or not Control Risk Group thinks that 2020 will have less difficulties and will be a better year from a risk perspective?
So in 2019, what we saw, and what actually we've been seeing for a few years, is the international rules-based system that has governed international relations for the past few decades and which has been gradually strengthening is now being placed under a huge amount of strain. So you're thinking things like the China-US tensions and the trade war there. You're thinking things like Brexit. You know, institutions like the World Trade Organization, down to the United Nations, to NAFTA, to the EU, are increasingly being challenged. And what comes with that challenge is also the fact that new populist leaders, whether they be President Donald Trump to Bolsonaro in Brazil to Modi in India, whoever they may be, are focusing more and more domestically, and they're making short-term policy decisions that are designed to appeal to their voter base rather than fit into a wider strategic plan. Now, for investors, that creates a huge amount of problem, because if you're not looking at long-term strategic plans, if instead leaders are making policy decisions based on what appeals to voters, or, you know, as we've seen in this election in the UK, for example, what will change a narrative in the media day to day, that creates huge uncertainty. How do you plan around that. Unfortunately, 2020 is just going to see a continued intensification of those problems. The China-US tensions are still there. Brexit is still an issue, especially when it comes to the US, the 2020 elections. You will see Trump making foreign policy on the basis of domestic policy and political concerns. And so from a global perspective, unfortunately, the risks are intensifying. The good news for Africa, and I'm sure we'll come on to some of these later on in the interview, is that in many respects it's bucking those trends.
So if we were to, you've mentioned there that countries as a whole have definitely become a lot more protectionist. And you mentioned Bolsonaro in Brazil. There are definitely the trade issues between the United States and China. And you have said that Africa has been bucking those trends. So it would lead investors or just the average person to think that Africa is definitely performing better. And over the recent years, we know that we've spoken at length about the potential Africa has. But in terms of realizing that potential and that translating into growth across the continent, it hasn't always been the case. What do you think needs to be done to make sure that Africa is in position to realize its potential?
It's a very good question. And I think a lot of countries in Africa are already moving in the right direction. In particular, you can look at some of the kind of new leaders who have come in since 2017 with grand, ambitious reform agendas. So we're thinking Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, President João Lourenço in Angola, arguably Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa also. In contrast to that short-termism that I just mentioned that we're seeing in populist leaders around much of the rest of the world, these leaders do have grand strategies, and investors in those countries know clearly where those countries and where those leaders are trying to get to. The point is that nothing can be changed overnight. The kind of cliche of the African big man leader who can change his country, just on a whim overnight, that's a myth. These are sophisticated and complex countries with sophisticated institutions, with economic realities, with a range of voices, often, expressing conflicting ideologies and interests. These things take time. And while there are certainly things that countries can do better and can do quite quickly, there's low-hanging fruit. Overall, it's I suppose a matter of patience. It's also a matter of, I think, investors becoming more educated about Africa and understanding how these reform agendas are going to develop, because unfortunately we still see either attitudes towards Africa veer towards overexcitement down to depression and claims that nothing will ever change. And in reality, the truth is a lot more complex.
Definitely very complex. And if we talk about institutions like the European Union, for example, when the United Kingdom does in fact leave, if that isn't pushed forward again, we'll know that it's definitely preparing itself for somewhat of a crisis, for the sake that it's a time where they don't really have an empirical example of, okay, we've had a country leave us before, so that's the framework we're going to use for the United Kingdom. There's a lot more uncertainty, especially in the European Union. But if we look at Africa, we know that we're moving towards the prospect of having a continental free trade zone, something similar to what the European Union have enjoyed for decades. Do you think that will happen soon in Africa? How close do you think we are to getting that free trade zone? So
the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, obviously it's been ratified by not every country, but by quite a large number now. There's been a lot of progress towards that in this year, and that will continue next year. It's a hugely important symbolic step, and it's a step in the right direction, but realistically it is going to take a long time. It is going to be probably a slow and torturous process before that sees a notable reduction in the trade barriers. What we are seeing, however, is a lot more progress being made within the regional blocks. So ECOWAS, SADC, the East African community is a prime example of this, and has made great strides towards reducing inter-regional trade barriers. And of course, the East African community, now that the Congo is mooted or proposed to join, again, that will probably be a long time before it happens, but that could really make the East African community a force to be reckoned with. Now, This, I think, is a hugely important process, and a control risk. We are monitoring this closely because it's, I think, essential to Africa's development. Everyone knows that Africa has this demographic bulge, this youth population, huge youth population that's coming up, entering the workforce. This could be a massive economic boom to Africa, or it could be a source of political instability if there's not jobs ready for those people. Now, Africa can't really follow the same development path that Asia followed, where developed Western economies outsource manufacturing and they use that manufacturing as a stepping stone in development, because that's not really realistic in an age of growing economic nationalism, which we've talked about in a lot of Western countries and elsewhere, age of growing automation. Instead, Africa needs to look at creating manufacturing in Africa to serve the African market. And that prospect for investors becomes a lot more attractive if they can access a wider market. There's no doubt that we haven't seen recent automotive manufacturing investment in Rwanda to serve the Rwandan market. It's too small. They have based themselves there to access the wider market. So it's a hugely important step for the continent's development. It's also, again, coming back to these global themes, a step that stands in contrast to the protectionism and growing protectionism we're seeing in the rest of the world. And yes, there's still huge barriers to this. Progress is slow. But if you're looking at a 30, 40-year investment in a mine, in a manufacturing plant, in whatever it may be, you want to be where, yes, there may be barriers, but it's moving in the right direction, rather than a developed Western country that already has those barriers down, but actually they may be going back up again.
If we were to look at manufacturing, specifically in the areas that you specialize in, that is East and Southern Africa, manufacturing specifically, where are we seeing examples of that type of growth in those regions?
So manufacturing growth, we're seeing quite a lot of interest all around the place, but it's still fairly early stage interest. I mean, it's one of the great I suppose, sadness of many of these countries that they still import some of their most basic manufactured goods and foodstuffs, which they could be developing in country. And of course, if they're exporting them, then that exposes them to external shocks and inflation and currency devaluations and all these problems. South Africa obviously has a very sophisticated manufacturing sector already. It's not going through the best economic time at the moment, but it has the framework and infrastructure there. It already has high-tech manufacturing, and there's a lot of potential if Ramaphosa's reforms start to make a difference for that to kind of take off again. Obviously, I mentioned Rwanda. We're seeing a lot of manufacturing interest in Rwanda because they've done an exceptionally good job of improving that business environment. I think that the challenge for all of this is manufacturing depends on infrastructure. You need the transport infrastructure to get the raw materials in and then to distribute the finished goods, and you need the energy infrastructure. And as I think we all know, Southern Africa especially has been struggling with its energy, electricity generation and transmission recently, not just in South Africa, but across the region. There are some positive steps being implemented to improve that. And actually what's really interesting about the energy sector is it's a perfect example of African-specific solutions to African-specific problems in these individual countries, where we're seeing really innovative, exciting steps towards things like geothermal or off-grid and microgrid solutions, which are not just using the old model that other parts of the world use of a centralized power plant and a wide transmission network, but actually thinking what works for these countries with huge areas, sparse populations, and isolated communities. So moving in the right direction, but still a few hurdles to manufacturing in a lot of countries. I'm
glad you mentioned the alleviating of Africa-specific problems with Africa-specific solutions. If we were to talk about infrastructure now, if we were to move a bit west and look at Nigeria specifically, we know that infrastructure has been a huge barrier in Nigeria as a whole, or as a country, being able to achieve its own economic goals. Earlier this year, we know that Nigeria's finance minister said that she believed Nigeria would need upwards of $100 billion every year for the next 30 years to bridge its infrastructure gap. A huge amount of money. when we look at figures like that, $100 billion for the next 30 years, are people correct to be pessimistic about Africa, Nigeria definitely being able to achieve its potential in terms of getting to a point where infrastructure really does fuel the bettering of the country and of the continent?
There are certainly, you mentioned the infrastructure gaps and the amounts of money necessary to close that gap, and it is a fairly daunting figure, and that is just for Nigeria, and obviously that similar figures are there across the continent. I think one thing that perhaps African governments could play on is this surge of geopolitical interest that we've seen in Africa. Over the past few years, really over the past decade, there's a traditional narrative around geopolitics in Africa, which is that it's a US-China rivalry, and they both have very different approaches to the continent. The US and other Western donors look for governance reforms in exchange for financial assistance, but don't pursue their own commercial objectives, whereas China openly pursues its commercial objectives. To be honest, that whole narrative is very outdated if it was ever completely true. Instead, what we're seeing is a range of new players, and you've mentioned some of them earlier. So Turkey, the Gulf states, Russia, India, who are making huge steps to increase their presence in Africa and increase their influence in Africa. And as they come in, it's forcing the traditional giants of China, the EU, and the US to change their approach also. So the US, for example, the Prosper Africa initiative that was announced in Maputo earlier this year, is explicitly looking at getting commercial opportunities for US companies in a way that they were never so explicit before. The EU is moving from its everything but arms initiatives, which are unilateral market access, to the economic partnership agreements, which are multilateral. All of these countries are trying to access commercial opportunities, and they are recognizing that Africa has a huge amount of potential economically. They're also recognizing that Africa has a fair amount of political clout, which is often overlooked, in that 54 countries in the UN General Assembly, no other region has as many, and as these institutional, global institutions, which we talked about, are under strain, countries are looking for allies. Now, for savvy African governments, there's no doubt that there's scope to play these countries off against each other, and to use that to get the financing and some of these huge amounts of money which is necessary to bridge infrastructure gaps or achieve other development goals. Again, last year we saw Kenyatta visit the US and China within a week of each other. That was clearly no coincidence. There's an element of being savvy and making sure that that African governments can exploit this surge of interest.
I'm really happy that you mentioned Prosper Africa and Everything But Arms as initiatives that the United States and European Union respectively have conjured up to make sure that their presence on the continent is beneficial for all involved. I noticed, though, that you didn't mention a similar initiative from China. Is that because China has failed or lagged behind those other countries in terms of not pacifying its presence, but creating a profile for its presence in Africa that is a lot more positive than it has been in recent years? Do you think that China has struggled to do that?
China's really interesting what's going on with China's relationship with Africa right now, in that it's coming from a different place from the US and the EU, in that it's always been open about its wanting to access commercial opportunities. And it has had huge success in increasing its economic presence and ties to Africa. So it is, as a single country, by far and away the largest trade partner of Africa. It's roughly $200 billion a year. The EU as a whole is about $300 billion, but of course that's 28 different countries. The US is down at about 40 or less. So China is a huge economic player. What China has realize is that it needs to start translating that economic clout into soft power, essentially. It needs to be able to kind of push for reforms, and it has been trying to push for reforms. You've seen that, especially in Zimbabwe. You're also seeing China get a bit wary in some countries where it's got its fingers burnt because it has assumed that it can go in and almost buy its way to success. But in fact, it faces the same challenges as any other investor. So what you've seen in the past few years is a subtle shift in China and its approach to the continent. So if you look at the last Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, it committed 60 billion in various grants and investment pledges to Africa, which is a huge amount, but it was exactly the same as the last FOCAC, whereas before it had been growing exponentially. Instead, it's focusing this money more on things like health and education and areas where it feels it can improve its image. It is becoming more and more involved in security cooperation in the continent, which it feels can help ingrain itself within the militaries of various countries and give it that political influence in that sense, while also improving the security environment for its own countries. And it's also set up the China International Development Cooperation Agency just last year, which is designed to coordinate its spending and its approach to Africa. What will be quite difficult for China is that its sale to Africa, if you will, the way it sells itself has always been, we will finance your infrastructure, we are not going to get involved in your politics. And how they shift from that to a place where they're like, actually, we do want some political influence, and we may be asking you to reform this or that, it's going to be quite a struggle for them.
If we were to look at corruption, I'm confident that a lot of people would say that is the biggest reason why Africa as a whole hasn't been able to reach its potential, while some analysts may disagree and say that the issues surrounding corruption and its effects have definitely been over-exaggerated. What would you say is more accurate from a risk perspective? How much has corruption played a role in the stifling of Africa?
I think the first point to note is, again, to go back to that kind of caveat that Africa is 54 countries. And there are countries such as Mauritius or Botswana, which are less corrupt than some European countries. They rank extremely well on all international indices and rankings trying to measure corruption. And then you have a place like Angola, which has an extremely poor reputation, and despite the reforms being introduced by new President Lorenzo, which are making a difference, that reputation is overall deserved. Corruption is definitely a problem. It is not specifically an Africa problem, obviously, but perspectives often disproportionately place the weight of that problem on Africa. What I would say is that most corruption can be mitigated and resisted. There are very few countries where an international investor, who needs to be compliant with all international legislation, such as the UK Bribery Act or the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, cannot operate without engaging in corrupt practices. It may take longer, and they may have to engage more in training, but it certainly is possible. Especially in the high-level corruption, it's often a lot more sophisticated than just a government minister asking for a bribe. It usually takes the form of pressure to partner with a local company that is then connected to the government. And if investors understand the nature of the problem and they go in prepared, for example, if they go in knowing who their local partner is going to be, having done the due diligence on them, and go to the government saying, well, this is our deal, take it or leave it, the governments will usually take it. There's very few governments and leaders who are going to say, well, no, you have to partner with this company or you're not getting the opportunity. And in most countries, especially those with new reformist leaders who are desperate to portray a good, attractive image of their country, you can escalate these any corrupt practices, you can find recourse and you can push back. It's just a question of understanding where that pressure is coming from and knowing how to deal with it.
Well, forgive me for trying my hardest to tailored consultancy advice from you. But if you were to look at Africa, tell us where specific hot points are, places that you would either say perhaps aren't ready for investment, the political or security risk is too high, and conversely places that are very much open for successful investment in the continent.
So all of this depends on investors' risk appetite. It's risk versus reward, and therefore difficult to kind of say X country or Y country. I would point to, for example, Ethiopia is getting a huge amount of attention. It is still a very challenging environment, but if you look at things like the telecommunications tender that they're putting out now, you're opening up a telecommunications market of over 100 million people that has previously not been accessible. That's hugely exciting despite all the risks and challenges that still come with investing in Ethiopia. If you look at Cote d'Ivoire, that's a really interesting country. There's a lot of concern about the elections coming up next year and whether you're going to see the same kind of instability that you saw after the 2011 elections. But if those elections proceed smoothly, Cote d'Ivoire is on a really good trajectory in terms of politics and economics and business environment reforms, etc. Similarly, Angola, hugely risky country, but a really exciting reform agenda, opening up new opportunities that were previously just not accessible to foreign investors. I won't go through a full list of all 54 countries, but as kind of a few that we are closely monitoring, I think those three, Angola, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, are particularly exciting.
Well, it's been a wonderful discussion with our time has just shot by completely. I would run the risk of asking you another question. I know we don't have time, so I will just wrap here and thank you very much, Barnaby. We do have time for another question. Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, this is going to be incredibly biased because I'm going to ask you about Nigeria.
Okay.
And we know that we're moving into 2020. Again, could you tell us what investors would be looking at briefly?
In Nigeria, what we're looking at is several key challenges.
Yes.
We're looking at monetary stability and the Naira and the stability there.
Right.
We're looking at security issues, obviously with Boko Haram in the northeast, Niger Delta, and then also the central kind of clashes that we've been seeing. And we're looking about Buhari's succession as we come up to 2023 and what's going to happen there.
Great.
Lots of challenges, but Nigeria is one of those markets you can't afford to ignore.
Absolutely. Well, Barnaby Fletcher from Control Risk Group, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us today.